everyone, and thank you very much for joining our panel discussion. We are very excited to have our panelists with us today to discuss what open means for the humanities. My name's Lucy Oates, and I'm co-chairing this panel today with my colleague Catherine Mitchell. And we've had the pleasure of working with our esteemed panelists to prepare for this interactive session. And we're really delighted to have our experts with us to discuss and explore what open means for the humanities and discuss some of the important questions around this area. And we think that at a time when open access publishing is accelerating, broadly speaking, we're really looking to explore what it means specifically for humanities disciplines and scholars and understand some of the specific challenges and solutions that exist in this space. So each of our speakers today, after a short introduction by me, will first explain their involvement and share some initial remarks on this topic, and then we'll move on to a discussion among the panelists, answering some questions and focusing on what we hope will be some thought-provoking questions, and we'll also be sharing those in the chat so that you can all see those as well and hear the responses. So please do feel free to comment on those in the chat too. We'll then move on to receive your questions and share those with the panelists and continue our discussion further. So as they come to mind, please do put any questions you might have into the Q&A feature, and we'll look out for those and share those when we leave time for that towards the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists that we have today. So we have Dr. Janneke Adema with us, who's a cultural and media theorist working in the fields of book publishing and digital culture. She's an associate professor in digital media at the Centre for Post-Digital Cultures at Coventry University, and has also been, she also explores issues in depth in various publications, but also by supporting a variety of scholar-led, not-for-profit publishing projects, including the Radical Open Access Collective, Open Humanities Press, Scholar-led and Post Office Press, as well as being the co-PI on the Research England and Arcadia-funded community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs project. So thank you, Dr. Adema, for joining us. We also have Dr. Kathleen Fitzpatrick, whose work across her career has focused on building resilient, sustainable scholarly communities and transforming their processes of communication to foreground connection, conversation, and collaboration. Dr. Fitzpatrick has published several books in this area and is project director of Humanities Commons, an open access, open source network serving more than 30,000 scholars and practitioners across the humanities and around the world. Between 2011 and 2017, Dr. Fitzpatrick was Director of Scholarly Communication and Associate Executive Director of the Modern Language Association, where she co-authored and oversaw the development of the 8th edition of the MLA Handbook. So thank you, Dr. Fitzpatrick, for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing from you. And we also have Dr. Erzsébet Tóth-Czifra, who works at the Open Science Officer of the European Research Infrastructure Consortium, DARIAH, where she's responsible for fostering and implementing policies and practices related to the open dissemination of research results in the humanities. Her advocacy activities include providing workshops, webinars, and other training activities on a regular basis. And she's also involved in European infrastructure building projects such as Open Air Advance, Ostp, and Triple. And as part of the Operas Plus project, she has been studying special traits, innovations, and barriers in the large-scale implementation of open access and open research evaluation practices in the social sciences and humanities disciplines. So we're very thankful to have you all here. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you for your initial remarks on our topic for today. So Kathleen, perhaps I can come to you first.
Thank you. I am going to share my screen. I just have a few slides that I want to talk through fairly quickly. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to get to present a little bit about Humanities Commons in the context of what we're doing for the humanities and open access. So as was mentioned, Humanities Commons is an open source, open access, but most crucially, I think, academy-owned and community-governed platform that's supporting collaboration and communication among all of those researchers and practitioners who are working across the humanities and around the world. We originally established this platform when I was working at the Modern Language Association. It began its life as MLA Commons in 2013 and was originally intended to provide space for member-to-member sharing and communication and new open access opportunities for MLA members. So we built the platform on top of the Commons in a Box platform, which is WordPress and BuddyPress connected with some other plugins besides. And we really committed ourselves both to open access in the material that was published on the network, as well as open source development of the software itself. In 2015, we expanded the functionality of the Commons to include an integrated Fedora Solr-based repository with a WordPress front end, right, which allows all of the members of the Commons to deposit their work and share it with their communities, to receive DOIs for the work that they deposit with us. That work then gets indexed by most of the major services, and it's able to be shared within the social network as well. So this was all MLA Commons to this point, but in 2016, we launched a pilot to broaden the Commons to the humanities, right? By thinking about how other scholarly societies might come together to collaboratively support a network that would allow all of their members within their own spaces to communicate in the ways that MLA members were, but that also would include an open hub that would permit anyone to join regardless of field or membership or institutional affiliation or anything, and take advantage of all of the network's features through that hub. So 3 things surfaced for us in the course of this pilot project. The first of which is that we very quickly discovered that scholarly society budgets aren't sufficiently robust to be able to support the kind of shared infrastructure that they really need and that might most benefit them and their members. The second thing that we discovered was that, though many societies see a space like the Commons as a nice to have, they don't see it as a core function, right? And having it connected to an open hub, in fact, made the societies that we were talking about bringing into the network less likely to want to support it financially than if it had been something that was exclusive to their members. And then the final thing that we discovered was that all of this condition, was reliant for us on grant funding. And that reliance on grant funding rapidly led to some significant technical debt, right? As well as an inability to keep developing and maintaining the functionality that our users required. So in 2018, we started a process of moving the network to a new fiscal host. It's now here with me at Michigan State University. We completed that move in 2020. And at that point, started turning our attention to thinking about what the Commons might do for institutions, in addition to scholarly societies. In the process of doing that work, we received, thankfully, 2 extremely significant investments of multi-year support, one from the National Endowment for the Humanities and one from the Mellon Foundation. And those 2 investments together have allowed us to staff up, to remediate our technical debt, and to begin the process of developing a forward-looking roadmap toward a sustainable future. And for us, a key part of that sustainability really did include this shifting of our focus from thinking about scholarly societies to thinking about institutions and the audiences that those institutions support, but as well the ways that those institutions might be themselves encouraged to support open source academy-owned alternatives to some of the less savory data capture platforms on which they currently rely. And we've been thinking about this platform as a space that can allow scholars to connect not just within their institutions, but with others in and across their fields, right? Making the potential for uptake greater, right? So it's a platform on which users can find their communities within their fields, within their institutions, and within their societies that they belong to in kind of overlapping Venn diagrams. But as we began this work to bring the commons to institutions, we started realizing that if we were going to do so, we needed to serve the entirety of the campus and not just the humanities. So we started thinking a bit about what the work that we had done in Humanities Commons might be able to contribute to fields beyond the humanities. And so we've recently been awarded a multi-year grant through the National Science Foundation's new FAROS RCN program. FAROS RCN stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, Reusable, Open Science Research Coordination Networks, right? So what we're planning to do with this grant in part is to modernize our repository platform and to create new integrations with key services and tools such as GitHub. That's all a part of establishing a node on the network that we're calling DBER Plus Commons, which is intended to support discipline-based education researchers who work across STEM fields. And there are several components to the project that are not really technical in nature, but that focus on, first of all, community building, and secondly, improving the standards and practices through which open science is conducted. And the most important of those to note is our addition of care to FAIR, right? So CARE is a set of principles that have been developed for Indigenous data governance, and adding CARE to FAIR makes it incumbent on us to ensure that the data that are shared and stored through the commons are not just findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but are also used for the collective benefit of those who are participating in the research. That the communities in which the data are gathered have the authority to control their use. That the researchers doing the data gathering recognize their responsibility to those communities, and that the relationships, the data, and the platform are all developed with ethical principles at their base. So DBER Commons in this way becomes a kind of unusual project, right? Not least in that, you know, as we understand it typically, innovations in scholarly communication are seen to originate in STEM fields and then gradually make their way into the humanities. We're instead focused on sharing the lessons that have been learned in the humanities, right? About the centrality of community building, about the need for ethical privacy and data reuse policies, and about the significance of strong community governance in developing this new platform for scientific communication. So I'm going to stop there, and I will look forward to talking as the panel goes forward.
Thank you. So now we'll move on. Janneke, would you like to go next?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy and Catherine, for inviting me. So I prepared a short statement also in response to the abstract for the panel. So I'm just going to read that out now. So my work as a researcher has kind of throughout my career focused on thinking through what the future of the book within the arts and humanities could be. And this very much includes a future in which books are openly available in order to encourage more equitable access to these books, as well as the conversations around them in the myriad of print, digital, and post-digital shapes and forms that our books and long-form scholarships takes. So I want to very much caution, though, that we shouldn't be focusing too much on these kind of simplified binaries between STEM and the humanities. And the kind of, again, what Kathleen has also emphasized, that the kind of presumption of an unequal flow of openness that has developed from the STEM towards the humanities And from there has kind of been taken up then in the humanities, where scholars such as Samuel Moore and Rebecca Kiesewetter, in their genealogies of open access, have already indicated that this flows the other way around too. So open access has a rich history and discourse in arts and humanities publishing cultures, and also look, for example, at long-standing traditions of scholar-led and university-supported open access in, amongst other, various countries within Latin America. This all indicates how the arts and humanities have been very much trailblazers in pushing forward the discourse around openness. So if there is anything that I would like to focus on here today as part of this panel, that maybe distinguishes the art and humanities from STEM fields, again, of course, not exclusively, is their preference then for publishing books or long-form scholarship. And it is here where our current increasingly kind of dominant commercial publishing compatible open access business and publishing models run into trouble, where it is certain, indeed, mainly article and STEM fields derived or applied models based on APCs, and in this context, BPCs, book processing charges, which are creating so much problem for the equitable publications of books in the arts and humanities. So to start addressing this and to highlight existing and develop further alternatives, it is essentially, especially in the book-based fields, that we start to see publishing as an inherent part of doing research, which means ensuring that there is sufficient funding or time given to scholars and their institutions to provide the labor involved in enable publishing, especially to ensure that the various institutions are involved in publishing, especially the scholar-led university and independent presses that are so crucial to these publication cultures in humanities fields, are sufficiently financially supported. And that also the publishing infrastructures that support their work and the diversity of publishing options that come with this to be able to flourish. To make sure that these are community-led and owned, and again, are financially supported by our research institutions and funder to enable this rich diversity of publishing and research cultures to thrive. Now, this focus, this follows on a kind of a model that I and others have developed as part of projects such as COPIM that Lucy already mentioned as part of my bio, and its various outputs, including the Open Book Collective, Opening the Future, and Tóth, but also through work with publishing collectives and communities such as the Radical Open Access Collective and Scholar-led. And all of these are initiatives that are arguing for publishing models in the humanities that move beyond BPCs and support more equitable, sustainable, community-led, not-for-profit diamond models of publishing. Now, connecting this to my work as a theorist, it also comes down to thinking through what a potential post-humanities could be, where in my recent monograph, Living Books, Experiments in the Post-Humanities, I outline and try to imagine more experimental, ethical, and critical futures for the monograph. So futures in which scholars take greater responsibility for their continued engagement with the scholarly book's becoming. So this requires a kind of ongoing critical investigation of our academic communication practices, our systems of knowledge production, and the debates that surround both scholarly publishing and the past and future of the academic monograph. So this involves also a critical exploration of how new digital tools and technologies offer opportunities to rethink and reperform the humanist fixtures, institutions, and practices that continue to shape the humanities. And these include single authorship, the book as a fixed object, and copyrights, and question our standard print-based parameters within the humanities, and asking why they have become hegemonic and how these fixtures relate to the discourse around openness in the humanities. Hence my call within Living Books to have more in-depth deliberations about the way that we do research in the arts and humanities and about the ways in which we perform and communicate it. And it is here that I think we can draw on, amongst others, the STEM fields to see if there are lessons learned and practices that they have taken up that might fit well within the humanities too. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Erzsébet, over to you.
Yes, hello everyone, and thanks a lot for having me today. So I also prepared a little slide deck for you just to give you, wait a second, this is the wrong version, just to give you a bit of a context and also uncover some of my biases about why open science, why open access matters to me as a humanist. And so the short answer to this is simply because back then the limitations in access to knowledge have been really tangible throughout my studies and later in my academic life as a Hungarian linguist. For instance, when one of us received an international scholarship, it was a rather shared community practice at my department to put together a shared wish list, which literature to bring home from those foreign libraries, which means that back then we had to cross actual physical borders in order to cross virtual ones, such as paywall. And of course, as I got familiar with the concept of open access and open science, it resonated immediately and strongly with such challenges. But on the other hand, what I saw is that sometimes we people working in the humanities domain do not feel completely addressed by some of the keywords or big agendas that you can find under this umbrella term of open access or open scholarship. So I'm talking about pre-registration or the publication of null results. What does it mean? But on the other hand, where are my books from this agenda? What if I don't generate my data, but instead collect them from libraries and archives and museums? What if I'm working in languages other than English? What if I'm working in a small discipline? How my citation impact will be shaped by that? How can we guarantee equal representation of smaller languages, smaller cultures, and who is going to reward all those invisible work that is associated with that? I think that resonates with the care principle that Kathleen already mentioned. So that said, it became pretty clear that regardless of the kinds of tool, the kinds of methodology, the kinds of environment we are working in, open access has to work for all of us. And this is where, or partially this is where my organization, DARIAH, comes to the picture. So if you haven't heard about it yet, DARIAH is a pan-European and digital infrastructure for arts and humanities scholars, a public organization. I know it's a rather mysterious concept, especially for those who are not listening from Europe, but you can imagine this organization is an European umbrella institution with a couple of hundreds of arts and humanities institutes as members from currently 20 European countries, in which scholars are networking, they're sharing tools, sharing infrastructures, sharing teaching materials, all those kinds of resources across Europe that makes scholar lives just a little bit easier. So that said, facilitating open access to resources is very much in the DNA of DARIAH, but it also became pretty clear that there is a more explicit work to be done in order to shape this cultural change. It's pretty significant cultural change. That is the change towards open research, change to open research cultures. And also there is a lots of support activities needed to that. And DARIAH as a EU organization, a domain-specific one, is a place for that. So here you can find a couple of ways in which we specifically advance or try to advance open access in the humanities. So speaking of the cultural change and changes, we find it really important to establish a discourse around open humanities or contribute to the already established discourse. So we have discourse spaces dedicated to that, such as the DARIAH Open Blog, but we also have a help desk service through which scholars can directly contact us. We can thank publishers for their books or papers. We can help them with licensing advisory, negotiations when it comes to reuse rights, and so on and so forth. It's also, speaking of optimizing the environment for open humanities, we are also contributing or we are also advising European policy making, because we find it super important that the new generation of fair and open access mandates really work for arts and humanities, and we see a bigger equity in this, both on the level of the actual mandates, but also on the level of the support structures available to execute these mandates and be compliant. But this is a slow stream of work to make a change here. We also realize that, especially through our advocacy work, that there are also burning challenges in parallel that require immediate action from us. And one of this is helping early career researchers in digital humanities to publish their first monograph, open access. This is currently something incredibly difficult to do so. So we have an open access book bursary for this purpose. We are an infrastructure, which means that we also have infrastructural components in place that feed into the open sharing of research results. So we have repositories across the national DARIAHs, both preprint and data repositories. And an important part of our work is to increase their representation, to make them compliant with big shared European or global scholarly information management systems. We like to experiment as well with novel publication and evaluation practices, such as the Open Methods platform. And speaking of experimentation and playing around, part of our work is to test the usefulness of digital humanities tools in the service of scholarly communication. For instance, we have an entity recognition tool developed that is applied by, that is used by publishers as well. But we also have a dedicated working group who are working with bibliographical data. So I think Janneke already mentioned that there is a, when it comes to arts and humanities scholarship, we have a rather intense and intimate relationship to publishing. This is true, and this also means that publications in many cases serve as research data for us. So we support that as well. And last but not least, we have a sister infrastructure called Oates, who is in charge of being an open scholarly communication for social sciences and humanities in Europe. And we are working together a lot, mainly in Horizon Europe projects, both to fill the gap when it comes to publicly owned open infrastructure for social sciences and humanities open publishing, and also to conduct meta studies on the actual situation, uptake, barriers, innovations, opportunities. So here you can find a couple of pointers. I'm going to share my slides at the end, so you can also click on the links if you are curious. Thanks a lot.
Thank you to all of our panelists for these remarks and for helping us to understand your work in these areas. We're now going to move on to a discussion format. We've established some framing questions to kick off the conversation, but we're also eager for you, the audience, to share any questions that come up for you along the way. For each of our framing questions, I will read the question and then ask one of our panelists to start the discussion. Depending on the topic, they may or may not all chime in. We'll do our best to cover as much ground as we can while giving our panelists time to speak on topics of significance to them and, if desired, to respond to each other's ideas. We'll also be sharing the questions in the chat as we ask them. Don't forget to add your own questions to the Q&A as they come up. Okay, so we'll kick it off with our first question, which will be directed to Kathleen Fitzpatrick. This question might seem odd given the previous discussions, but we're going to start at the very most basic question. Is open scholarship important for the humanities, and if so, how?
So I take it as a given that you assume I'm going to say yes. It is important for the humanities, and I think that is a very safe assumption. The how, I think, is perhaps not the most straightforward part. On the one hand, you know, as Erzsébet was detailing in her presentation, open access to scholarship in the humanities is really crucial to ensure that folks around the world have equal footing in being able to get to the products of scholarly research. But open scholarship is something more than that, right? It requires not just open access, but open participation, open ability to contribute to the conversation. And that is a quite different thing. So I think open scholarship in the humanities is absolutely crucial in both of those ways. And for one particular reason that I want to stress, as we've seen, particularly in the US, it's also an issue in the UK right now, it's an issue in Canada. We are seeing threats to the humanities as a fully funded set of fields within our institutions. We're seeing descriptions by politicians of the humanities as being somehow a luxury in a time when we need more scientists and we need more engineers. So what open scholarship in the humanities can do is demonstrate publicly and openly and in dialogue with the public the significance of research in the humanities and why it ought to be funded. I mean, no one is going to care about our work if it's all hidden. And so we have to really find ways to make it more open and public and more conversant with the public in order to receive that level of public support. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Janneke or Erzsébet, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with what Kathleen is saying, and also indeed the importance around showcasing the impacts of humanities research through open access publishing. And I'd like to add to that, I think also the importance of openness for rethinking again what publishing is, what the book is, what kind of forms we use to publish, and how we can kind of use digital tools again alongside existing tools to really get that conversation around research, to broaden that out, to kind of showcase that again too. And this, you can see this in forms such as open annotation and open peer review, and also again to highlight the important role that the humanities and also small humanities publishers, scholar-led publishers, have played in pushing forward that debate around what experimentation is for the book and for scholarship in humanities. And for this to function, we, beyond again open access to our scholarship, we also need again these open infrastructures, these platforms, that software that help us to kind of build upon our research and to kind of think through what other forms of publishing might work better maybe than the ones that we've already been using to communicate our research now and in the future. So openness there is the basis to kind of start with asking those questions about what the best ways of communicating are and will be.
And maybe a last and very short remark. I think lots of arts and humanities scholars actually fight a lot for the open dissemination of their research. And by fighting, I mean really many fronts. In many cases, it's a complicated challenge, like when they have to deal with third-party materials, for instance, then it means a double negotiation, backwards with the Cultural Heritage Institution for the reuse rights, forwards with the publisher. So sometimes I think that it's a lots of extra and in many cases invisible work and fight involved in that. But on the other hand, openness and like working alongside of the commons is also, it also can feel more natural for arts and humanities scholars in many cases, because they are working with artifacts that belong to our collective cultural memory, you know. So they are very well aware that knowledge is not an exclusive property of an individual, let alone of a publisher. And we are not working in ivory towers. The complexities really start when these principles have to be translated to actual compliances with open access mandates and actual business models.
Thank you all. I think you've really established a very compelling argument for open access in the humanities. So our panel's work is done. The next question actually picks up on something that Erzsébet was just referencing. And this is a question that will start with Janneke responding to. How would you describe the level of interest in open scholarship and open access publishing among humanities scholars at the moment?
So I think, so the best way to approach that, I would say the kind of more analytical way, is that I think there's 4 typical kind of groups or responses towards open access. And again, these are kind of more ideal types, right? Or generalizations, if you want. So I think one of them would be the typical open access enthusiast, right? So that's the person who is an advocate of open access, who has been kind of promoting that within their fields, and really see this as something that, as we've highlighted in the previous question, I guess, as something that's good for more equitable access, for ensuring that data is fairly shared, for making sure that future forms of publishing can be experimented with, et cetera, et cetera. So these tend to be people that have been doing open access for a while already, and you know, that are familiar with it. So that's kind of one ideal type, I would say, and one typical kind of response. Within the humanities, there's also a large group of people of what I would maybe call open access alarmists. So these are people who perhaps from, I would say, more traditional and conservative stance around what the humanities is and what the humanities publishing is. So this is very much based still on then ideas and practices of the book as a printed book, and kind of a cautiousness of being afraid of what open access would do to the integrity of the text, of the long form argument, and based often on what I would say are misguided perceptions on consequences for quality assessment and plagiarism and predatory publishing. So there's a lot of fear here around openness, copyright, appropriation, etc., etc. So a third group or stance that I would identify is what I would call the open access critics. So these are people who are not necessarily against open access, but who are mainly critical of the ways that open access is being adopted, right? And being introduced. So these are issues, people who are talking about issues around business models that are being used to support open access, basically around why, how open access is seen as maybe yet another regime that's opposed from a top-down way by our universities and our funders, as part of our kind of assessment systems like the REF in the UK, or is seen as a kind of an extension of more market-based and neoliberal forms of the university and academia. So this is quite a growing group of people, also more on the left wing of academia, I would say, that take this kind of critical stance towards open access. So and a fourth group then, I would say, and this is probably the largest group, is what I would call the open access agnostics. So these are the people that, you know, that are kind of following along, that know a bit about open access, but maybe not that much. They have a feeling maybe that they don't really understand a lot. And actually, these are the people that, you know, in my institution that I talk with most. And I have to say that probably on a weekly basis, I have a call with somebody who wants to talk to me more about what kind of options are there for me to publish in open access. So a lot of work, I think, still needs to be done with these open access agnostics to kind of get them to the point that they know what is available for them. And now these ideal types, of course, I won't have a clear idea, I think, of what the percentages are, and they're also not like groups, they're stances that people can take in, right? So at some point, people will take in an alarmist stance or an agnostic or a critical stance. And I think I find myself somewhere between the enthusiasm and the critical most of the times. But yeah, what I would like to say that in addition to that is that I think that, for example, in the UK, a lot of this discourse around openness is currently being shaped by mandates, right? And this can be problematic. This is not an argument against mandates necessarily, but this is about how a lot of people get to know about open access and about the discourse. And these kind of mandates are not always the best way for scholars to engage with open access, or the first way in. So my recommendation would always to look more at kind of more bottom-up approaches towards open access, and have conversations with scholars about where open access comes from, and how these kind of approaches to open access have also been developed, and being cautious of the kind of discourses around top-down open access. So I think that's what I'd like to add to that.
Other thoughts? Okay, thank you. The next question, and we have a lot of great questions popping up in the Q&A, and so I want to make sure that we don't miss the opportunity to engage with those. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then maybe, Lucy, we can jump to some of the Q&A questions and then circle back around. So the next prepared question is for Erzsébet, and this question is really a matter of sort of spelling out for us, what are some of the day-to-day challenges facing humanists who are looking to engage with open scholarship and open publishing practices? And then are there scalable solutions to these challenges?
Thanks a lot, Catherine. I restrict myself to focus on the challenges part, and there are colleagues who actually work much more than me on the actual solutions. But so what we can see also from our advocacy and this help desking activity is that there are primary barriers and secondary challenges to open accessing in humanities. And the primary entry barriers is, of course, the elephant in the room, which is like we are still not quite there when it comes to equal possibilities, equal funding models for open access books versus open access journals. This is probably the biggest one. And to be very honest, especially at the beginning of kicking off the help desk, it was a huge ethical challenge to me personally, how to address this, because we've been contacted by people, doctoral candidates who PhD students, young researchers who were just about to publish their first monograph, and they wanted to, as my late and beloved colleague John Tammet said, stay on the right side of the history and make it open access on the one hand, but on the other hand, they also wanted to secure a job in academia. And we all know that like this situation is very, very deeply determined by what we call the prestige economy. Publisher prestige matters a lot, especially as long as somebody is so exposed to the current assessment system as early career researchers are. Once you are a tenured professor, you can really make a difference. Once you need to fight for a permanent contract, you are not in the position to do that. So for me personally, it was a big ethical challenge what to respond to that. Should I tell them that, yeah, sure, go for open access, or how should we go for it? And this situation gave rise to the early career researchers book monograph, the open access book bursary that we have at DARIAH. This is a small and immediate help so that these scholars in this vulnerable situation don't need to choose from publisher prestige and open access. I really truly hope that in a couple of years this will be superfluous and the business models and the funding situation for open access books will be much, much, much more equitable than that. And this will not be a question. But what we see currently is that there is a big funding gap in many cases, even though institutions are wealthier and they have article processing charge or even book processing charge funds institutionally. Young scholars are not always, or in many cases, not part of this or not eligible for this funding. Same is the limitation for transformative agreements. So that said, what we can learn from this situation is that many implementations of open access currently, especially Western implementations that are deemed to be non-sustainable in the hard sciences, are simply impossible in the humanities, which also means that the solutions that the colleagues are developing in response to these domain-specific challenges are something that can change the whole open access implementation for the better. This is important. But these are the primary issues. Secondary issues is something that I already mentioned, negotiation backwards and forwards when it comes to the inclusion of third-party content. This is a complex ethical, legal, technical bunch of challenges in many cases where scholars need to be supported in this complex interplay between publishers themselves, their institutions, and the cultural heritage institutions. This is a complex challenge. And here is a controversy here. I just had a look at the chat, and there is a question about public humanities. What we see is that in many cases, those publishers, for instance, in a case of art history monographs or art history books, these books are made in many cases for a broader audience, are published with publishers who are working also not only for academia, but also for a broader audience of citizens. And although they are already doing kind of public humanities in a many cases old school way via the print and the like, and they're having a public humanities mission, the canonical open access mandates and all that it takes and the business models are completely foreign to them. So there is a lot of bridging work to be done in this respect as well. And a last thing that I want to highlight, because DARIAH, my organization, is working mainly for digitally enabled arts and humanities, or digital humanities in a more strict sense. A secondary challenge is whether once somebody able to publish the research outputs open access, whether the already existing structures serve the best their digital scholarship, or there are misalignments in this respect. And in many, like, that's a big discourse within digital humanities. Colleagues who are much smarter than me, for instance, Martin Paul Eve repeatedly pointed out how much digital humanists need to do the double work. So they need to develop the tool or publish the data set or implement a service. And then as a second step, they need to gift wrap it into a canonical research paper so that they are recognized formally for their efforts. So at least mitigating the double work in this respect and better aligning open access publication with research realities, this is a big, big, big work ahead of us.
So can I surface one of the things that Erzsébet pointed to as a particular challenge, as I think the most pernicious of the challenges that we face, and this is not just in the humanities, this is across the sciences and the social sciences as well. It's an academic problem generally, which is the problem of prestige. We live in a prestige economy in which if the most prestigious journal in which to publish your work only goes to 50 subscribers, then that's the place you're supposed to publish it, because it's the most prestigious, regardless of the fact that the impact of an article there might be a whole lot lower than a public journal that goes out to millions of people. So really what we need within the academy, and this is particularly true of the humanities, but it is true across the board, is a real reckoning with our ideas about prestige and why it is we pursue particular kinds of markers of what counts as quality, as what, you know, what is worthy of promotion and of tenure in the US context, or of a high mark in the REF in the UK context. I mean, like there are all of the mechanisms that we have for transforming the ways that scholarship gets done and the impact that it can have in the world are really bound right now by those considerations of prestige. So what's the solution to this? I mean, some have argued in the past that the solution is to raise the prestige of open access, right? By either flipping prestigious journals to open, or by demonstrating that open access scholarship is subject to all the same rigor and that it has more impact and all of those things. For me, I mean, I honestly believe that prestige is in and of itself a problem, and that the more that we can stop thinking about those markers of who is better and who is less good and all of that, and get to thinking about impact in the public sphere and among public discourse, the better off we'll be. This is a heavy lift, and it has to start, you know, in our departments, it has to be in our colleges and universities, it has to be within our scholarly societies, it has to be a conversation at the national level and the international level. I mean, we really have to start rethinking that at every level if we're going to make real transformation in the ways that scholarship and society work together.
And I'd like to chime in there too. Indeed, I think this is such an important issue, and specifically also in relation to these discourses of excellence, right? Of the idea of always having to be better, and this idea of growth, and you know, this is really unsustainable, especially for kind of the kind of research that we do within the humanities. And my response to this question was also partly related to what Jean-Claude Godon has put in as one of the questions in the chat, which is around the monograph form, because I think it's again that monograph form and a specific way that we implement it, right? And then the kind of practices and traditions around it that still are so much connected to this idea of prestige, of excellence, and of quality. And letting go of this would be, you know, for me already a very, not letting go, but thinking through what would be alternatives to this that might be more ethical, more better to actually communicate our research would be such an important step for the humanities. And I do think this is one of the challenges, that it's not only in the specific kind of way we attach prestige, but the issue around prestige, but in the way that we attach it to certain media forms, and that these media forms then become these aspects within our publishing practices that almost become impossible to change, especially again for early career researchers, as Erzsébet already has indicated. And this becomes then such a hard conversation to have, because yes, of course, to be able to get along in humanities fields, we need to publish in certain forms, with certain presses, with certain publications, and kind of starting to break this down and focusing on, again, the different forms in which we can do research within the humanities, and the different forms that research in the humanities takes, which can be more digital, multimodal, and beyond print, will be incredibly important. That being said, I don't think that means that we need to let go of any kind of long-form scholarship, because long-form scholarship in its own, of course, has a place. I think it's the connection to the specific print-derived formats that is complicated and that we might want to question more.
Thank you all. That was, and thank you for drawing in the questions from the audience. So I was going to be, Janneke, before you spoke, I was going to ask whether we need a reckoning around prestige. Do we need a reckoning around the monograph, and a reckoning of the monograph? Does the monograph need to exist? There's one other topic that came up in the questions, and that is the issue of just the financial either burden or advantage the monograph gives to publishers, depending on whether or not it has crossover interest, and whether it sells well or whether it is a loss leader for the press. And so how would you imagine this future in which there is a long form publication of some sort, perhaps not the monograph as it is currently sold? What would the effects on the university presses be in a world like that?
I can think, starting that off, I think one of the questions is that we always have the feeling that now with open access or with digital publishing, all of a sudden we'll have this solution for the book, right? That we'll now be able to find these sustainable models, when of course this has never been a sustainable format. I think it's more about rethinking what we think scholarship is and seeing publishing as an integral aspect of that. And so we've grown accustomed to kind of outsourcing that and then into a kind of an economy in which publishing is supposed to be profitable, right? And this doesn't fit with the kind of research that the humanities does, of course. So it's about drawing it back in again and seeing this as something that is essential to what we do and is essential of kind of funding research in the humanities. And I think, you know, for university presses or for smaller presses within the projects that I support, such as CoPIM, we're all building towards helping these smaller presses towards with the aid of new membership models and new business models, and together with open infrastructures. And there's a lot of projects within this ecosystem of community-led and community-owned publishing and scholarship that are looking at new ways to support these kind of book publications. And I think that is one way that we could start doing that, right? But I think it's really important to start moving away from this idea that the digital and open access is all of a sudden going to be a kind of panacea towards an issue that we've had for such a long time. And of course, we need to think through how these models and how these digital tools can help us to create different forms of skill. You know, open infrastructure will be able to support us in that. But there's no easy solution to that, right? It's about collaborating. It's about taking this discourse away from this idea of profit and outsourcing. And I think that would be a first step, I would say.
I like that quite a lot, and would only add to it that I would love to see us in a scholarly communication ecosystem in which individual scholars no longer felt quite the same kind of pressure to be producing books. Right now, the book remains a kind of gold standard, both for, you know, tenure and for later promotion. It's the marker of like the sustained project in the humanities. And I would really love for the ecosystem of humanities work to be so opened that a scholar could produce a book, but when it's really meant to be a book, right? When it needs to be a book, then that all of those other things that sort of get forced into book shape by our institutional requirements instead could take the shapes that they need to be, in which, you know, we wouldn't need to do the double work that Martin-Yves noted in the earlier comment of the digital project and the book about it, but instead would be able just to focus on the digital project, or would be able to produce a new structure for publishing text in a sustained but serialized form that could produce something quite different. So I think right now we're stuck with institutional policies, and again, I'll come back to that notion of prestige, that require us to be publishing way more books than we ought to, quite frankly. And if we were able to focus on the ones that really are meant to be books, we could think about that a little bit more apart from the questions of the business model that drives them.
In my response, I would like to move away a bit from the publisher side and move closer to the scholar side. That is, I really love this idea of Kathleen, like diversifying the long form of scholarship and go beyond the scope of book, or go for transitional forms like the network monographs. But this requires two cornerstone line of improvements. The first of all, for this to happen, there is a much closer collaboration needed between publishers, be it university publishers, scholar-led publishers, or any other types of publishers, and the research infrastructure world. If you are going to publish network monographs, the data underlying, or the data visualization, or the software, or the Jupyter notebook, or whatever, needs to be hosted in a public environment. And the responsibilities and roles had to be sorted out between scholars, institutions, public research infrastructure, and the publishers And this is complex, but it's by far not impossible. This is the first thing. The second thing is, as you also said, there is a vicious circle in which open access publishing or scholarly publishing in general is lingering. That is, scholars says, why bother submitting something innovative as long form of scholarship, as long as we are still assessed by publisher prestige? That prevents solidifying the evaluation cultures around those born digital forms of scholarship. And this is something super important to go against and support and facilitate as much as we can. Like tools and services and other non-bookish types of scholarship will be countable by formal research assessment once we have evaluation frameworks in place.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I have noticed that there are several questions that are really sort of circling around the issue of what is this going to look like in the future? You know, I think that all of you have been suggesting that there are already new models that we can draw on to help shift the space and ensure a more public humanities and ensure humanities that isn't sort of constrained in genres and publication processes that seem not to serve either the humanities or the public. So could you all just take a few moments to talk about leaping forward 15 to 20 years? How do you envisage a humanities scholars research and publishing experience to have changed? And for anyone who has asked a question, if we don't get to it by the end of this session, please do follow up with the speakers to get more information. There's a lot of interest in the work that you're all doing on the panel, and we certainly want everyone to continue to talk about that. But let's just focus now on all of the questions that are sort of circling around this issue of where are we headed? You know, what is this going to look like in the future? And I encourage anyone to speak up to begin the conversation.
So my sort of outer shell of pessimism has one answer for this question, and it's not a good one, and it's not anything that anybody at this conference wants to hear. So I'm going to delve inside and I'm going to pull out my inner optimist and talk about like what I would like 15 to 20 years from now, the landscape for scholarly communication in the humanities to look like. And I would like it to be predicated on a radically different evaluation and assessment system than we're seeing either within our institutions or at the consortial or national level, which is to say a system in which, and this is something that's being prototyped right now within the college that I work in, the College of Arts and Letters at Michigan State University. My dean, Chris Long, and his associate deans have been working on instating a new method of evaluation and assessment within the college that asks every faculty member, but also every staff member, right? Everyone in every position within the college each year to articulate what their long-term goals for their career are, right? Like your horizon, what does success look like to you? Where do you want to get with your career and why? And then along the way toward that long-term goals, what are the markers that would let you know that you're making progress in the right direction? What are the things you need to accomplish in order to get down that path? And then the assessment becomes this much, much more individuated conversation between the department chair and the faculty member, or the unit director and the staff member, or what have you. That's all focused on, like, are you making that progress? And what support or what shifts do you need in order to make that progress? If we have that mode of assessment, that is what's happening within our institutions and across our institutions, then we're going to see radical differentiation in what scholarship looks like in 15 to 20 years, because some scholars are going to want to reach communities that are not necessarily going to be reading the same kinds of texts that we're reading, and success to them looks like support for those communities. Other scholars are interested in performance, or they're interested in exhibitions, or they're interested in media production that reaches different audiences and different communities. And that's the form of work that they're going to be producing, and that's what success is going to look like. And then there are going to be scholars who want to write books for other scholars, right? And who want to know that they've had a real influence in the scholarly field. And that's the work that they're going to be doing. And so my hope is that if we can get to this much more individuated understanding of what it is to transform a culture intellectually, we might be able to start thinking or building a system that's going to support all of those different forms of cultural work, and that's going to support the outcomes of that work too.
Well, if I would answer that question in kind of a speculative way, if that is okay. So I'm going to go away from reality a little bit more also at this point. But I'm hoping that in the future, and that this might be way longer than 15, 20 years, but that there will be a publishing system that actually supports the conversation of scholarship, the research conversations that we want to have. And that there would be some kind of a publishing system that allows us to contribute to this conversation without having to publish objects, right? Without having to kind of always be able to kind of have this object, which then is responsive. We want to have a publishing system in which we can actually contribute to this conversation in all the kind of different forms and shapes that it can take. So that's one thing. And that there are, I mean, this is a very, again, utopian prefiguration, I would say, right? Because this would entail that there would be one kind of space in which, you know, there is some kind of equitable access. So maybe this would be different spaces, I imagine, or different kind of more situated practices around communities in which communities take much more ownership of both their research and their publishing environments. The other aspect that I would like to see more maybe in any future for the humanities in relation to publishing is one in which humanities research, and this comes a bit from my cultural studies background, is much more focused on changing the world, on impacting the world, on actually seeing how research, humanities research, and again showcasing this, right, is already intervening in the world, is helping to solve problems that we are facing, right? And there's so many things at the moment around disinformation, around, you know, equitable access again to resources, to supporting kind of issues around health and the environment. And these are all important things that humanities has things about to say. And how can we kind of stimulate actual changes in the world through our research, to have that more public facing? I think that was one of the things that also came back in a question. So to move away maybe only from an openness towards others in the research community, towards a more public facing scholarship that contributes to this kind of more public conversation. So these are kind of two things that I would hope we would see in this foreseeable future.
Yes, along very similar lines, what I can add to that is like in a visionary and very optimistic future, we would like to see all these domain-specific innovations to the implementation of open access that is moving away from pay-to-publish models on an individual level, making like there is sufficiently diversifying epistemic cultures will become a reality. I can echo this realignments of the many, or harmonization of the many forms of practicing public humanities with the canonical and open science mandate flavors of open access publishing. There is a realignment need to be happen here. And like in very practical terms, I really hope that on the one hand, my advocacy job will become much easier because the business models, the open access publication possibilities, the innovations will be much more faceted and much more abundant. And I also hope that some of the bridging intermediary solutions that we have in place, for instance, the monograph bursary that we have, that we are running currently, will become completely obsolete because much more equitable and large-scale models of open access publishing will be available. And maybe a very last thing, I think a crucial issue that is currently probably not that visible in everyday realities is multilingualness, the digital representation of smaller, bigger languages, and its consequences, not only long-term consequences, not only on the digital economies, but also on our everyday lives. The amount of language input available in different languages, not only to upscale publication and scholarly information management systems and making small non-English language journals visible in Web of Scholar and Scopus and other systems, but also on a much broader scale, the consequences of the non-availability or restricted availability of certain digitized language input to artificial intelligence and the like. It's really difficult to be 100% optimistic here. So let me just highlight that when it comes to multilingualness, we also have an incredibly lot and important work to be done in order to save our reality as it is now.
Thank you all. So we still have more time, and we managed to make sure we got in those futures that you imagine, and we didn't mention the awful futures necessarily, so we don't have to go there. But I think that it is important to sort of note, especially what Erzsébet was just sort of referencing, the questions of bibliodiversity, linguistic diversity, geographic diversity in the space. And I just wanted to ask whether any of you want to sort of pick up on that at this point, or we could also just circle back around to some of the more specific questions from the audience. So any more thoughts on this last point before we move to the next? Okay, thank you. So there's a specific question about Humanities Commons. What role do open educational resources play in Humanities Commons? And more generally, what is the role of open access in relation to arts and humanities teaching resources, textbooks, etc.?
So that's a great question, and I'm really glad that it got asked. Humanities Commons is a strong supporter of open educational resources. We have a large number of OERs that have been deposited in our repository, some that are being built via websites on the Commons, and we're really wanting very much to encourage the use of the Commons for that purpose. Right now, I mean, the role of open access for teaching resources is really crucial. But there are a lot of items that sort of, how to put this, things within the OER universe that haven't taken the form of traditional publications, right? They fall into that category of great literature. They're objects of scholarship. They're objects that are used in teaching and learning, but they're not necessarily the kinds of things that could be published in traditional venues. And one of the benefits of Humanities Commons is that our repository accepts a lot of different forms of scholarship. It's not just the journal article and the monograph. We accept syllabi, we accept lecture notes, we accept diagrams, we accept data sets, we accept a whole bunch of different stuff. And for that reason, people are able to share through our network kinds of things that they might have in the past posted on their own website, but that you would have to know about the website really in order to know that they were there. We have discovered through this process that far and away the most downloaded objects within the repository are syllabi. That folks who are really interested in thinking about a new class and in, thinking, okay, well, I have to teach the introductory class in this field this semester, and it's been a long time since I've taught it, so I want to see what other people are doing, are able to go to the repository and see a whole bunch of options that can help them think through what they're doing. And similarly for lesson plans and class notes and slides and presentations and a whole bunch of other kinds of stuff that folks have put there explicitly to be built upon and to be reused by other members of the community. So I think that, you know, the OER landscape beyond the textbook is a really core component of what it is that we've been doing at the Commons. We're hoping in this next transition, as we start, you know, we're making our repository infrastructure more robust and building out greater connections between the repository and the websites that use that information, to be able to allow objects in the repository to be republished in the context of collections, so that an individual scholar could come through, find the things that they're interested in the repository, and put together a site that is the collection of the work that they want to use, whether it's in their classroom or in some other research context. So I will leave that there, but I think Humanities Commons is a great place for getting that kind of work out because of its non-traditional nature.
Thank you. Okay, on to the next question. Would you say the transformation academic publishing is going through with regard to open access has any similarities to the digital transformation general trade publishing went through with the self-publishing in early 2009, 2010, and beyond? Any thoughts about this question? This is maybe a question of authorship and professionalization, the professionalization of publishing, how folks might be operating independently in this space as opposed to working within the established structures for the dissemination of knowledge.
So I was wondering if open access didn't also go through that phase, right? I mean, I have the feeling that 2009, 2010 academic publishing had the blog phase, I would say, right? So I think that is quite similar in that sense towards any self-publishing, and it's trying out different platforms, I guess. So if the question is whether it's going through that now again, well, I think that's interesting, because I think platforms such as Humanities Commons, right, they filled in that void, actually, I think quite well, that happened once the blog form kind of moved more towards Twitter and other kind of open platforms. So they actually offer ways again now to kind of post scholarship that's not just short form in the form of a tweet or anything like a post on a social media platform. So in that sense, I think, and other platforms that are being developed now to like pop-up and that are a little bit more easier to assess for scholars and to kind of to access and to publish their work on. I think in that sense, yes, but I think, yeah, this is my kind of my response to that, I think, in short. Yeah.
I agree with that, and I think the comparison to the moment of the blog is a really good one. I mean, the blog itself has been somewhat overcome, as you note, by Twitter and Facebook and all of these other social networks, where all of that conversation that blogs were generating has sort of been sucked. But I think that there are still some key things to be learned from that trade publication moment that I think open access book publishing is really reckoning with right now, one of which has to do with labor, right? Authors who went the self-publishing route and still go the self-publishing route have discovered that all of the jobs along the way in the publication of a book, from copy editing to typesetting to publicity and promotion to getting the book into the channels where it can be discovered and found, like all of those become the responsibility of the author or someone the author individually hires in order to do that work. So the labor doesn't go away simply because the structure of the publishing publisher goes away. And similarly, in open access book publishing, the publishers are having to find ways to ensure that that work can still be done, whether it's being done through, whether it's being funded through subventions that are being paid to the press, or whether it's being funded through other mechanisms. And I think that one of the things that hasn't happened yet in this moment in open access scholarly book publishing is a full examination of what those other mechanisms for funding might look like other than subventions, right? So I think, you know, Martin Eve, again, through some of the work that he's been doing with Open Library of the Humanities, the COPIM project, similarly, have been thinking about, you know, what are the mechanisms for funding that can keep a diamond open access publisher of monographs alive. And that is a massive problem that really needs to be solved, that I think, you know, individual authors are not going to be able to hire the copy editors and the publicists and so on in order to get their books out into circulation. They still need support. Figuring out where that support comes from and how it gets funded is key.
What I would like to add to that, I would like to come back to the idea of self-publication and its different flavors. And if we see the whole function of scholarly communication and journals and the like in a historical perspective, the original idea was to exchange letters, right? Across knowledgeable people to exchange ideas. Of course, lots of diversification and prestige economy and institutionalization happened since then. And what we see, especially when you're working with digital humanists, is that there is a functional complementarity between the official established tracks of scholarly communication and different forms of self-publications that allow for a more rapid exchange. So in many cases, what we see is that by the time a monograph gets out, or even a research paper, it takes years, not one, not two, in many cases more than that. And you can imagine all the technological advancement that happens in the meantime that are not always captured in a crystallized, polished research article or book. So parallel to that, we see a lots of rapid real-time discussion ongoing on social media, on blogs and podcasts and the like. And these have functional complementarity because a book marks a landmark, a solid landmark in one's intellectual journey. It is to be long-term archived, it is to be preserved, while a Twitter exchange or a blog post is not always something to keep on a longer term. It has a more temporary function. So I really love this kind of functional complementarity, and I think those forms of self-publication who naturally occur due to this will thrive in the future. The interesting question is, if we are talking about the crisis of peer review and all the challenges associated with peer reviewing the many kinds of humanities topics, the digital scholarship, all this diversity, whether we could reach back to those social media discourses or blogs where actually lots of evaluation and assessment work is naturally happening, what are the mechanisms to reach back to these natural places of modern contemporary research evaluation and channel them back to more established, more rigid structures of scholarly communication? There's something that fascinates me recently.
Thank you. So something else that's coming up here that's very interesting is sort of the rhetoric that we use when we talk about open access in the humanities or open access in general. And certainly, you know, the linguistic questions around this, something that Erzsébet has also been talking about a bit. We had a comment from Bernie Folan in the chat about referring to, she prefers to refer to self-publishing as independent publishing because of some of the implications of self-publishing and the way that it might suggest a lesser quality. This brings us back around to another question that we had framed for the discussion around how open access is discussed, in this case, in the context of the UNESCO recommendation on open science that was adopted in 2021. And it was intended to define shared values and principles for open science and identified concrete measures in open access and open data with proposals to bring citizens closer to science and commitments to facilitate the production and dissemination of scientific knowledge around the world. The document acknowledges that although it references open science specifically, it means science as research more broadly. So just for all of the panelists, how important do you think this terminology and language is when we're looking to make a compelling case to humanists to participate in open scholarship? And I guess we can start here with Janneke because we originally intended to, but I hope to hear from everyone.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting question because, of course, what they wanted to do in the UNESCO recommendations is to kind of have it as a kind of a broad and inclusive term, right? They explain that also in a document. And there is, of course, also a kind of a linguistic issue here. Again, like what you already said, Katrin, it's around that in certain language contexts, such as in the Netherlands, Wetenschap, and in Germany, Wissenschaft, this has then been translated into science. And so in these kind of contexts, open science makes sense, maybe, right, from a linguistic perspective. But still, I think I'm still a little bit puzzled why other terminologies such as open research or open scholarship, right, would not also capture. So there is still this again, hegemonic idea of the sciences being the kind of overarching element of our communities. And of course, there's an argument too around open science then including things such as open data, open infrastructure, and all those kind of elements of it. But still, I do feel that open research or open scholarship could fit that narrative too. There's also, I guess, specific arguments. I think Marshall Knochelmans has written quite a lot about this, around this idea that open science is a specific discourse, of course, and that a discourse that has been developed within STEM fields, and that's then being applied to the humanities. And from this perspective, there is a call, for example, to develop a specific open humanities discourse as a kind of an alternative. And I do think there's value in that, but I also think that at the same time, you know, these kind of conversations about what openness means probably needs to happen on different levels. So it might need to happen within fields or within research and publishing communities in specific, right? And this comes back again to questions of situated openness, of kind of situated knowledges. So having these conversations about terminology within our communities, I think, remains important, and having ways for us to kind of think about how we name these kind of practices and self-identifying this, right? Without having then this overarching thing saying you are the open humanities or you are. That being said, I do think there is an argument to be made for the humanities to put forward. And I think, Kathleen, you did that in the beginning already very well, what it is that the humanities, you know, brings forward to that specific discourse. But yeah, so I do think it's problematic. I prefer open research or open scholarship to open science where possible.
I would absolutely echo that and say that in the US context, I have repeatedly seen somebody mention open science and my colleagues in the humanities go, oh, good, well, they're not talking about us. So we don't have to worry about that. And really finding ways to think about open research, open scholarship, open knowledge as being the framework that we're working toward, I think matters quite a lot. I also see that an anonymous attendee has asked about the OSTP memo and how it'll affect the humanities. And I think this is another one of those key moments where the OSTP memo from 2020, 12, I don't even remember, I mean, the history time, what even is it anymore? Whenever it was the prior OSTP memo that was promoting open access for federally funded research, from agencies that had over $100 million annual in grant making, basically kind of locked itself down on the sciences, right? The humanities, the arts, other fields were able to say, phew, we don't have to worry about that right now. Well, the new Nelson memo makes clear that it is all federally funded research and that it is immediate open access, that embargoes are meant to be done away with as well. And this is going to have a profound effect on the humanities. I mean, it's not going to be transformative in the same way that taking the NIH and the NSF and making them go full open access will, because in those fields, pretty much all research in the US is funded at some level. The vast majority of research in the arts and humanities is not funded, and certainly is not funded federally. They're relatively small budgets, and they have a relatively small number of projects that are able to be funded every year for that reason. But nonetheless, leadership from the NEH, the NEA, IMLS, and other organizations that fund in humanities and social science fields, I think are going to have a really transformative effect on what open knowledge production in those fields looks like moving forward. So I'm really excited to see what happens.
Just very quickly follow up on the last point of Kathleen. Indeed, I agree with Janneke and Kathleen. As an ex-linguist, I think I'm credible to say terms are never really only terms. You know, there are many underlying epistemological, structural biases behind them that I was trying to point out at the beginning of my presentation. And this manifests itself on multiple levels. On the one hand, indeed, in many cases, like we lose community engagement via the term open science. So I remember back then when I arrived to Open Access Open Science, I was invited to an advocacy event and somebody told me, like, oh yeah, sure, you can pretend you are a scientist, which was a moment for me to realize that in English, unlike my mother tongue, I don't even qualify as a scientist or Wissenschaftler in German. But this terminological, epistemological mismatch is very much present upwards in the policy discussions. So in many cases, arts and humanities in these policy debates are considered as the wild child of research disciplines, of the different disciplines. And one result of that is that like humanities native forms like open access books come as an afterthought of policy mandates. We put forward this open science, open access policy, and later we are going to think about compliance in terms of books. It's very, very welcome to see that there is a lots of momentum currently in this respect to change this for the better. And it seems that it's not only us who are working actively in open science advocacy and infrastructures, but also research funders started exploring possibilities of what they themselves can learn from open access solutions coming from the humanities.
Thank you so much. Lucy, Oates, and I would love to just thank our panelists, Doctors Janneke, Adema, Kathleen Fitzpatrick, and Erzsébet Tóth-Czifra for these insightful and powerful discussions of the opportunities, the challenges, and the interventions of the humanities in the world of open access. All of our speakers have given us a lot to think about today, and we're extremely grateful to them for joining us. And thank you to the audience as well for listening and for your excellent questions, for engaging with the important ideas that have emerged in this session. The next panel, which is the last one of the day, focused on experiences with Subscribe to Open, will follow in 15 minutes after the break. Attendees can stay connected or come back anytime using the same Zoom link. And thank you all for joining the OASPA 2022 conference.